In the vast tapestry of Tolkien's Middle-earth, few mysteries capture the imagination quite like the fate of the Blue Wizards. While Gandalf the Grey guided the Fellowship, while Saruman the White fell to corruption, and while Radagast the Brown wandered among beasts and birds, two other Istari vanished into the eastern reaches of the world, never to return to the tales we know. Their names were Alatar and Palando, though they were known in the tongues of Middle-earth as the Ithrin Luin, the Blue Wizards. Sent by the Valar alongside their more famous companions, they accepted perhaps the most perilous mission of all, to journey into the very heartland of Sauron's dominion, where his influence was strongest and his servants most numerous. What happened to them in those distant lands remains one of the great unresolved mysteries of the Third Age. Tolkien himself offered conflicting accounts of their ultimate fate, sometimes fearing they had failed and fallen into darkness, other times suggesting they had achieved great success in weakening Sauron's power. This deliberate ambiguity has sparked decades of speculation, debate, and theory crafting among fans of the legendarium. Tonight, we explore 6 of the most compelling theories about what really befell the Blue Wizards in the far reaches of Middle-earth. From tragic falls from grace to heroic last stands, from quiet failures to secret triumphs, these theories attempt to fill in one of the most tantalizing gaps in Tolkien's mythology. Some draw directly from the professor's own words, others extrapolate from hints scattered throughout his writings, and still others spring from the collective imagination of those who refuse to let this mystery rest unsolved. The mission to the east. Before we delve into theories about their fate, we must understand the magnitude of what the Blue Wizards were asked to do. When the Valar decided to send the Istari to Middle-earth around the year 1000 of the Third Age, they were responding to the growing threat of Sauron's return. But while Gandalf, Saruman, and Radagast were sent to aid the free peoples of the West, the elves, men and dwarves, who would become the primary opponents of the Dark Lord, the Blue Wizards received a far more dangerous assignment. They were to go into the east and south, into the very lands where Sauron's influence was already strong, where the peoples had long fallen under the shadow of Melkor worship, and where 2 lone wizards would have no allies, no safe havens, and no hope of rescue should their mission go awry. It was, in many ways, a suicide mission disguised as divine intervention. The strategic importance of this mission cannot be overstated. While the West would field perhaps tens of thousands of soldiers in the great battles of the War of the Ring, the East could potentially have provided Sauron with hundreds of thousands, even millions of additional troops. The Easterlings and Southrons who did march to war represented only a fraction of the vast populations that dwelt beyond the Sea of Rhûn and in the far reaches of Harad. Tolkien himself recognized this disparity. In his later writings, he noted that without some form of intervention in the East, Sauron's forces would have outnumbered the West to such a degree that victory would have been impossible. The implication is clear: the Blue Wizards were not sent on a secondary mission, but on what may have been the most crucial assignment of all. Yet they vanished from history almost as soon as they departed. The Chronicles of Gondor make no mention of them. The elves of Rivendell and Lothlorien seem unaware of their activities. Even Gandalf, their fellow Istari, speaks of them only in the past tense, as if their fate were already sealed. They went into the east of Middle-earth, we are told, and do not come into these tales. This absence from the historical record is itself significant. In a world where the deeds of heroes are preserved in song and story, where even the smallest acts of courage are remembered and retold, the complete silence surrounding the Blue Wizards suggests something extraordinary, whether extraordinarily good or extraordinarily terrible. Theory 1. The Fallen Servants. The first and perhaps most tragic theory about the Blue Wizards' fate draws directly from Tolkien's own fears about their mission. In a letter written in 1958, the professor expressed his concern that they had failed as Saruman did, though doubtless in different ways, and suspected that they might have become founders or beginners of secret cults and magic traditions that outlasted the fall of Sauron. This theory paints a picture of gradual corruption, a slow fall from grace that mirrors Saruman's own descent but takes a different form. Where Saruman's corruption was rooted in his desire for power and his jealousy of Gandalf, the Blue Wizards' fall might have stemmed from isolation, despair, and the overwhelming nature of their task. Imagine Alatar and Palando arriving in the east, to find themselves surrounded by peoples who had known nothing but the shadow of Melkor worship for generations. The local traditions, the very languages spoken, the fundamental assumptions about reality itself would all have been shaped by millennia of corruption. To these peoples, the Valar would be unknown or actively despised, while Melkor, even in his bound state, remained a figure of reverence and fear. Faced with such overwhelming opposition, the Blue Wizards might have concluded that direct opposition to these beliefs would be futile. Instead, they could have chosen a more subtle approach, working within the existing religious and cultural frameworks, while gradually trying to introduce more benevolent elements. This strategy, while perhaps well-intentioned initially, could have led them down a dangerous path. Over the centuries, the line between strategic compromise and genuine corruption might have blurred. The Blue Wizards could have found themselves not just adapting to local customs, but actually embracing them. They might have begun to see themselves not as servants of the Valar, but as rightful leaders of the peoples they had come to guide. The step from religious teacher to cult leader is often shorter than it appears, especially for beings of such power and knowledge. In this scenario, Alatar and Palando would have established mystery cults centered around themselves, promising their followers secret knowledge and magical power. These cults might have nominally opposed Sauron while actually serving similar purposes, keeping the people in spiritual darkness, preventing them from developing the kind of free thought and moral courage that might have made them effective allies of the West. The most chilling aspect of this theory is its plausibility. We know from Saruman's example that even the wisest of the Astari could fall to corruption when isolated from proper counsel and faced with seemingly impossible tasks. The Blue Wizards, operating in far more hostile territory with even less support, would have been even more vulnerable to such temptations. Some interpretations of this theory suggest that the secret cults and magic traditions that Tolkien mentions might have persisted long after the War of the Ring, spreading corrupted versions of genuine wisdom throughout the East. These traditions could have become self-perpetuating systems of spiritual oppression, ensuring that even with Sauron's defeat, the peoples of the East would remain trapped in darkness for generations to come. The evidence for this theory lies not just in Tolkien's own words, but in the complete absence of any Eastern peoples who joined the fight against Sauron. If the Blue Wizards had remained true to their mission, surely some tribes or nations would have resisted the Dark Lord's call to war. The fact that the East and South seem to have provided Sauron with nothing but loyal servants suggests that any opposition the Blue Wizards might have organised either failed completely or never existed at all. This interpretation casts the Blue Wizards as tragic figures, well-meaning servants of the light who became part of the very darkness they were sent to combat. It's a sobering reminder that good intentions are not always enough, and that the road to hell is indeed paved with compromises that seemed reasonable at the time. Theory 2. The Secret Heroes. At the opposite end of the spectrum lies a far more optimistic interpretation of the Blue Wizards' fate, one that draws from Tolkien's later reconsiderations of their story. In his final thoughts on the matter, the professor suggested that they might have had very great influence on the history of the Second Age and Third Age in weakening and disarraying the forces of the East, who would otherwise have outnumbered the West. This theory transforms the Blue Wizards from mysterious failures into unsung heroes, covert agents working behind enemy lines to ensure that the forces of good would have any chance at all in the coming conflict. Rather than falling to corruption or despair, Alatar and Palando would have remained true to their mission while adapting their methods to the harsh realities of their situation. The scope of their potential achievement becomes clear when we consider the true scale of Sauron's domain. The Dark Lord's influence extended far beyond Mordor itself, reaching into the vast steppes of Rhûn, the deserts of Harad, and lands even more distant that appear on no maps of Middle-earth. The populations of these regions would have numbered in the millions, far exceeding anything the West could muster. In this heroic interpretation, the Blue Wizards would have spent centuries working to prevent this vast human tide from being fully mobilized against the Free Peoples. They might have operated as wandering teachers, spreading subtle counter-propaganda that undermined Sauron's claims to divinity. They could have worked to preserve or revive knowledge of Eru Ilúvatar and the true Valar, providing spiritual alternatives to Melkor worship. More directly, they might have functioned as saboteurs and agitators, stirring up rebellions among subject peoples, encouraging tribal warfare that prevented unified action, and generally ensuring that Sauron's recruitment efforts in the east were far less successful than they might have been. Every tribe that refused his call, every leader who chose neutrality over service to Mordor, every young warrior who deserted rather than march west, all of these small victories might have been the fruits of the Blue Wizard's long labour. The evidence for this theory lies in what didn't happen as much as what did. When Sauron finally revealed himself and began his final push for dominion over Middle-earth, the forces he was able to muster, while formidable, were not overwhelming. The armies that marched to the Black Gate were sufficient to make the Free Peoples despair, but they were not so vast as to make resistance literally impossible. This suggests that something or someone had indeed been limiting Sauron's ability to fully mobilize the East. Tolkien himself noted that the Dark Lord had powerful enemies behind his back, and that his gathering of armies had not been unopposed. Without the Blue Wizard's interference, the hordes that appeared at the Pelennor Fields might have been 10 times larger, making victory impossible even with the return of the king. The Blue Wizard's success in this scenario would have been measured not in grand victories or glorious battles, but in the quiet prevention of disasters that never came to pass. Every Easterling tribe that remained neutral, every Southron nation that failed to answer Sauron's summons, every potential ally who never arrived to reinforce Mordor's armies, these absences would have been their true monuments. This interpretation also explains why the Blue Wizards never returned to the West. Having spent centuries building networks of resistance and trust among the Eastern peoples, they might have concluded that their work was not yet finished. Even with Sauron's defeat, the fundamental problems that had made the East vulnerable to his influence would have remained. The Blue Wizards might have chosen to stay and continue their work of education and healing, helping to ensure that the darkness would not return. In this reading, the Blue Wizards become almost Christ-like figures, servants who sacrificed any hope of recognition or reward to work among the poorest and most oppressed peoples of Middle-earth. Their absence from the tales of the West is not a sign of failure, but evidence of their complete commitment to those who needed them most. Theory 3. One faithful, one fallen. The contradiction between Tolkien's early fears and his later optimism about the Blue Wizards has led some theorists to propose an elegant solution. What if both accounts are true, but apply to different wizards? This theory suggests that Alatar and Pallando met divergent fates, with one remaining true to his mission while the other fell to corruption or despair. This interpretation has several advantages. It allows us to reconcile Tolkien's conflicting statements without dismissing either as merely superseded. It also reflects the realistic possibility that two individuals, even close companions, might respond very differently to the same extraordinary pressures and temptations. The question of which wizard fell and which remained faithful is open to debate, but the names themselves provide some intriguing clues. Alatar, whose name means aftercomer in Quenya, was chosen by the Vala Orome, the Hunter, a figure associated with the pursuit of evil and the protection of the innocent. This connection might suggest that Alatar possessed a stronger moral compass or greater resistance to corruption. Pallando, whose name means Farseer, was chosen to accompany Alatar, but his selection seems to have been based more on friendship than on any particular fitness for the mission. This secondary status might have made him more vulnerable to feelings of inadequacy or resentment that could have been exploited by the forces of darkness. In one possible scenario, the two wizards might have begun their mission working together, but gradually developed different approaches to their impossible task. Alatar might have insisted on maintaining their original goals and methods, while Pallando became convinced that more dramatic measures were necessary. This philosophical divide could have eventually led to an actual split, with each wizard going his separate way. Alatar, following his more conservative approach, might have continued to work as originally intended, building genuine resistance to Sauron while maintaining his own moral integrity. His efforts might have been slower to bear fruit and more difficult to sustain, but they would have represented authentic progress toward the goals set by the Valar. Pallando, perhaps driven by impatience with their slow progress and horror at the suffering he witnessed, might have concluded that the ends justified any means. He could have established the kind of mystery cults that Tolkien feared, using deception and manipulation to build a power base that could oppose Sauron more directly. Even if his intentions remained good, his methods would have corrupted both him and his followers. The tragic potential of this theory lies in the possibility that the two wizards might have eventually found themselves in opposition to each other. Alatar, discovering the true nature of his companion's activities, might have felt compelled to oppose him. Pallando, viewing Alatar's approach as naive and ineffective, might have seen him as an obstacle to be removed. Such a conflict would have been devastating on multiple levels. Not only would it have divided their limited resources and attention, but it would have provided Sauron with opportunities to exploit their enmity for his own purposes. The Dark Lord would have been delighted to watch his two greatest potential enemies destroy each other while he consolidated his power elsewhere. This theory also offers a possible explanation for why neither wizard was ever heard from again in the West. If they had indeed turned against each other, the survivor, if any, might have been too ashamed or traumatized to return. Alternatively, their conflict might have weakened both of them to the point where neither was able to effectively continue his mission, making their ultimate fate irrelevant to the larger struggle. The psychological realism of this scenario is perhaps its greatest strength. The idea that two friends faced with an impossible situation and operating without support or supervision for centuries might grow apart and eventually become enemies is all too plausible. It reflects the kind of moral complexity that Tolkien increasingly favoured in his later writings, where good and evil are not always clearly distinguished, and where the greatest tragedies arise from the conflicts between different kinds of good. Theory 4. The Lost Wanderers. Not every failure requires villainy or dramatic corruption. A fourth theory suggests that the Blue Wizards simply lost their way in a more mundane sense, becoming so absorbed in the immediate needs of the people they encountered that they lost sight of their larger mission. This interpretation draws parallels with Radagast the Brown, who was said to have become too interested in the animals and growing things to remain focused on the war against Sauron. The appeal of this theory lies in its psychological realism and its compassionate understanding of how good people can fail without becoming evil. The East would have presented the Blue Wizards with countless immediate crises: famines, plagues, wars between tribes, natural disasters, and all the daily sufferings that afflict mortal beings. For powerful and compassionate beings like the Astari, the temptation to address these immediate needs, rather than focus on abstract long-term goals, would have been enormous. Imagine Alatar and Pallando arriving in a region where drought has brought a people to the brink of starvation. Their magical knowledge could save thousands of lives by finding water or improving crop yields. Would it be moral to ignore such suffering in favour of political organising against a distant threat? The wizards might have concluded that their first duty was to the people immediately before them, not to some grand strategy conceived in Valinor. This pattern, repeated countless times over the centuries, could have gradually transformed their mission entirely. Instead of working to undermine Sauron's influence, they might have become beloved local figures: wise men who helped with harvests, healers who cured diseases, teachers who preserved ancient lore, advisors who helped settle disputes between communities. Such work would have been genuinely good and valuable, but it would have done little to address the larger threat that Sauron represented. The Blue Wizards might have saved thousands of lives and improved the lot of countless individuals while entirely failing to build the kind of organised resistance that their mission required. The geographic scale of the East would have made this problem even worse. Unlike the relatively compact regions of the West, where news travelled quickly and events in one area affected others, the vast expanses beyond Rhûn were home to hundreds of different peoples separated by enormous distances. The Blue Wizards might have found themselves constantly moving from one crisis to another, never remaining in any one place long enough to build lasting institutions or train local leaders who could continue their work. Over time, they might have lost not just their focus, but their sense of urgency about the larger war. Surrounded by immediate human needs and far from any source of information about events in the West, they could have begun to doubt whether Sauron really represented the existential threat that the Valar believed him to be. After all, from their perspective in the distant East, the Dark Lord might have seemed like just another distant tyrant, less important than the warlord currently threatening the valley they were trying to protect. This theory gains additional credibility when we consider the Astari's fundamental nature. They were sent to Middle-earth in the bodies of old men, subject to physical fatigue, hunger, and the full range of human emotions. Unlike their true Maiar forms, these incarnated versions were vulnerable to despair, loneliness, and the gradual erosion of purpose that can affect anyone engaged in a long and difficult struggle. The absence of any support structure would have made this problem even more acute. Gandalf had the White Council, irregular though its meetings were. Saruman had his position at Isengard and his network of agents. But the Blue Wizards would have had only each other, and if they became separated, or if one was killed, the survivor would have faced his challenges in complete isolation. In this reading, the Blue Wizards' failure to return to the West or to play any role in the War of the Ring represents not corruption, but a kind of institutional capture. They became so embedded in the local communities they served that they lost the ability to see beyond immediate needs to larger strategic questions. They might have lived out long and useful lives, remembered fondly in the oral traditions of various Eastern peoples, while being completely irrelevant to the fate of Middle-earth as a whole. This theory suggests that good intentions and even good actions are not always enough to achieve good outcomes. Sometimes the greatest failures come not from doing evil things, but from doing good things at the wrong time or in the wrong way. The Blue Wizards might have been perfect examples of how decent people can fail to rise to great occasions, not through any moral flaw, but simply through a lack of the specific kind of wisdom needed to navigate complex strategic situations. Theory 5. The Noble Martyrs. A fifth theory combines elements of success and failure by suggesting that the Blue Wizards did indeed accomplish significant victories against Sauron's forces in the east, but paid for these achievements with their lives. This martyrdom theory portrays them as heroes whose sacrifice, while unknown in the West, was crucial to the ultimate victory over the Dark Lord. In this interpretation, Alatar and Palando would have initially succeeded in their mission, building networks of resistance, encouraging rebellions, and significantly disrupting Sauron's plans for the East. Their work might have prevented the mobilization of vast armies that would otherwise have marched on Gondor and Rohan. For decades or even centuries, they might have operated as successful guerrilla leaders, constantly staying one step ahead of their enemies while inflicting real damage on the Dark Lord's infrastructure. However, their very success would have eventually made them targets that Sauron could not ignore. As their activities became more effective and their networks more extensive, they would have drawn increasingly serious attention from Mordor. The Dark Lord might have eventually dispatched some of his most powerful servants, perhaps Nazgul or Balrogs or other corrupted Maiar, specifically to hunt down and destroy these troublesome Istari. The final confrontation, when it came, might have been epic in scope. Picture Alatar and Palando, perhaps aided by their most loyal followers, making a desperate last stand against overwhelming forces of darkness. They might have held a crucial mountain pass to allow refugee populations to escape, or defended a hidden city that served as the center of Eastern resistance, or simply fought to destroy some vital resource that Sauron needed for his war effort. Even in defeat, their sacrifice might have achieved its strategic purpose. The forces that Sauron committed to destroying them would have been unavailable for other tasks. The disruption of his supply lines and recruitment efforts might have continued to have effects long after the Blue Wizards themselves were dead. Most importantly, the example of their courage might have inspired continued resistance, even without their direct leadership. This theory draws support from Tolkien's observation that Sauron faced powerful enemies behind his back, and that his gathering of armies had not been unopposed. The implication is that something significant was happening in the East to limit his effectiveness there, even if the details never reached the chroniclers of the West. The timing of the Blue Wizards' potential deaths becomes crucial in this interpretation. If they fell early in the Third Age, their networks might have gradually decayed, explaining why Sauron was eventually able to mobilize substantial Eastern forces for the War of the Ring. But if they survived until relatively late, perhaps falling only when Sauron revealed himself and began his final preparations for war, their resistance might have succeeded in delaying his plans just long enough for the West to prepare its own defenses. There's a tragic poetry to this interpretation that appeals to many fans. The idea that the Blue Wizards died unknown and unsung, far from their homeland, fighting desperately to protect people who would never know their names, resonates with themes that run throughout Tolkien's work. The professor was deeply influenced by his experiences in World War I, where he witnessed countless acts of heroism that went unrecorded and unrecognized. The martyrdom theory also explains why the Blue Wizards never returned or sent word to their colleagues in the West. Dead heroes cannot file reports or request reinforcements. Their silence becomes not evidence of failure or corruption, but proof of their ultimate sacrifice. In some versions of this theory, the Blue Wizards' final stand might have involved not just their own deaths, but the destruction of something crucial to Sauron's plans. They might have succeeded in destroying a fortress, eliminating a key lieutenant, or disrupting a supply network that the Dark Lord had spent centuries building. Their deaths might have been the price of a victory whose strategic importance was only revealed later, when Sauron found himself unable to execute plans that had depended on resources the Blue Wizards had destroyed. This interpretation transforms the Blue Wizards from mysterious failures into tragic heroes whose sacrifice was essential to the Free People's ultimate victory. It suggests that the War of the Ring, far from being a purely Western affair, was actually the climax of a much larger conflict that had been raging across all of Middle-earth for centuries. The Blue Wizards, in this reading, were not peripheral figures who vanished into irrelevance, but central players whose contributions were simply hidden from the historical record. Theory 6. The Eternal Wanderers. Our final theory takes a different approach entirely, suggesting that the Blue Wizards' fate cannot be understood within the conventional framework of success and failure, because they transcended those categories altogether. Rather than meeting some definitive end during the Third Age, they might have continued their journey indefinitely, moving ever further from the lands of which we have record. This interpretation draws on the mystical elements in Tolkien's work that suggest Middle-earth is part of a much larger world, most of which remains unexplored and unmapped. Beyond the Sea of Rhûn lie the East Bight, and lands that may extend to other continents entirely. South of Far-Harad, the maps simply end, leaving vast expanses that may contain wonders and terrors beyond imagination. The Blue Wizards, having completed whatever role they were meant to play in the struggle against Sauron, whether successfully or unsuccessfully, might have felt called to continue their journey into these unmapped regions. Perhaps they were drawn by reports of other evils that needed to be confronted, or by the desire to explore the farthest reaches of Iru's creation. Maybe they simply found that after centuries in the East, they had lost the ability to return to the more familiar lands of their origin. This theory gains plausibility from the Astari's fundamental nature as servants of the Valar, beings whose perspective on time and space differs radically from that of mortals. What seems like abandonment or disappearance to humans might feel to them like a natural progression from one phase of existence to another. Just as Gandalf was able to return from death with enhanced power and authority, the Blue Wizards might have undergone their own transformations that freed them from the limitations of their original mission. The idea of eternal wandering also fits with certain themes in Tolkien's broader mythology. The professor was fascinated by the concept of the straight road that allows certain beings to travel from Middle-earth to the Undying Lands, bypassing the curvature of the world that traps mortals within the circles of the earth. Perhaps the Blue Wizards found their own version of this straight road, one that led not westward to Valinor, but eastward to realms that exist beyond the boundaries of normal geography. In practical terms, this might mean that the Blue Wizards are still out there somewhere, continuing their work in lands so distant that news of their activities could never reach the chroniclers of Gondor or Rivendell. They might be helping peoples who have never heard of Sauron or Morgoth, confronting evils that are unrelated to the great conflicts of the Third Age, or simply exploring the infinite diversity of Iru's creation. Some versions of this theory suggest that the Blue Wizards might eventually return to the lands of the West, but not for centuries or millennia yet to come. Their reappearance might herald some future crisis that will require their particular knowledge and experience. Alternatively, they might return only after completing some vast task whose scope dwarfs even the defeat of Sauron, perhaps the healing of all the damage that Melkor inflicted on the world during the Elder Days. The appeal of this theory lies partly in its refusal to provide closure. In a genre where every mystery is eventually solved and every character's fate is revealed, the Blue Wizards remain genuinely unknown. This theory preserves that mystery while transforming it from a failure of imagination into a positive statement about the limits of knowledge and the vastness of existence. It also reflects something important about Tolkien's own relationship to his creation. The professor repeatedly emphasized that Middle-earth was meant to feel like a real world, with a real history, most of which could never be fully recorded or understood. The Blue Wizard's disappearance into the unknown preserves this sense of a world that extends far beyond the boundaries of any story. From this perspective, asking, "What happened to the Blue Wizards?" is like asking, "What happened to all the people who lived in the parts of the world that were never mapped?" The answer is that they lived their lives, faced their challenges, achieved their victories and suffered their defeats, but did so in places and times that lie beyond the reach of our particular story. The Blue Wizard's fate is unknowable, not because Tolkien failed to imagine it, but because some things are meant to remain unknown. Conclusion: the enduring mystery. After examining these 6 theories, we're left with a profound appreciation for both the complexity of the Blue Wizard's situation and the wisdom of Tolkien's decision to leave their fate unresolved. Each theory offers compelling explanations that fit with different aspects of the evidence, yet none can claim to be definitively correct. The fallen servants theory reminds us that good intentions are not always enough to prevent corruption, especially when operating in isolation under extreme pressure. The secret hero's interpretation suggests that the greatest victories might be those that go unrecorded and unrecognized. The divergent paths theory reflects the realistic possibility that even close allies might respond differently to impossible situations. The Lost Wanderers scenario illustrates how good people can fail to achieve their larger goals, while still doing meaningful good in the world. The Noble Martyrs interpretation transforms apparent failure into hidden heroism, while the Eternal Wanderers theory suggests that some stories are too vast to be contained within any single narrative. Perhaps the most important insight to emerge from this examination is that the Blue Wizard's mystery serves a crucial function in Tolkien's overall vision. In a genre often criticized for providing too neat resolutions to complex problems, the unresolved fate of Alatar and Palando stands as a reminder that real history is full of gaps, that important actors sometimes vanish without explanation, and that the consequences of our actions often remain unknown to us. The Blue Wizards represent something essential about the nature of heroism itself. Most real heroes work in obscurity without recognition, often without even knowing whether their efforts have succeeded. They make their choices based on principle rather than certainty, and they persist in doing what they believe is right, even when they cannot know what the ultimate consequences will be. Whether the Blue Wizards fell to corruption, achieved hidden victories, met noble deaths, or simply wandered into the unknown, their story reminds us that courage is often measured not by dramatic gestures, but by the willingness to take on impossible tasks with imperfect information and no guarantee of success. In their very mystery, they embody one of Tolkien's most important themes, that the fate of the world often depends on choices made by people whose names will never appear in the history books. The question of what happened to the Blue Wizards may never be answered definitively, and perhaps that's as it should be. Some mysteries are more valuable than any solution could be. In a world that demands answers to every question, the Blue Wizards stand as guardians of the unknown, reminders that there are still places on the map marked "Here be dragons," and that some roads go ever on into territories that no story can fully explore. Their legacy lies not in any particular achievement we can point to, but in the space they preserve for possibilities beyond our current understanding. They remind us that Middle-earth is vast enough to contain stories we haven't heard, heroes we'll never meet, and victories we can't imagine. In an age that sometimes seems to have explained everything, the Blue Wizards keep alive the wonder of not knowing, and the courage to act in the face of that uncertainty. Thanks for joining us in this deep dive tonight into one of Middle-earth's greatest mysteries. Until next time, stay safe and stay by the fire.